All right, so Jeff Escalante works at HashiCorp, and he's going to talk to us about scaling static sites with NextJS.
Cool.
Thank you, Jeff.
Hey. Thank you. I'm excited to be here. I hope that I will be able to talk loud enough for this. So let me know if I'm like trailing off. I'm not naturally a very loud talker. But let's get right into it. There's a lot to get through. As was mentioned, I'm Jeff. I work for HashiCorp. I work on web architecture for about 10 or so websites there as part of the marketing department. I'm a big advocate of JAMstack. I have been since the very start. I've worked on 2 static site generators that some of you may have heard of or used at times called Roots and Spike. And I'm here to declare my friendly intentions towards JAMstack. However, I also kind of want to get a little bit real about things. I think it's really important when you are an advocate of something to make sure that you really thoroughly understand both the pros and the cons, the strengths and the weaknesses. And I'm here to maybe break the mold a little bit by talking about some of the weaknesses of JAMstack and some of the problems that come up and how we might be able to get around those. So before I go in there, I want to show this lovely graphic. Some of you may recognize this graphic if you read a blog called Wait But Why. If you don't, I definitely recommend it. It's great. It talks a lot about thinking and logic and philosophy and the ways that people form and hold opinions. And they have these really cute hand-drawn graphics that represent different ways of thinking. And at the top of this scale here is the scientist way of thinking, which is very objective and rational and based on evidence and unbiased. And they have these different tiers that kind of go down to what the bottom tier is called zealot, which is kind of like, this is what I believe. I don't care if there's any evidence or rationality behind it. And anybody who doesn't believe this, they're a terrible person. So I would encourage everyone to try to keep their mind up in this zone while hearing me out here and not assassinate me because it's really important to kind of like have a balanced viewpoint. So with that being said, let's move on to my first series of slides called The Problems with Static Architecture. I'm kind of going to blow through these quickly. I'll leave plenty of time for questions and angry comments at the end if need be. But just bear with me while I run through these pretty quickly initially because I've got a lot of material today. So first problem, unbounded page growth. I did a little philosophy exercise for you all where I combined 2 truths into a combined truth. So the first one is the more unique pages your static site has, the slower it compiles. I hope we can all agree with that. The second one, as your organization, you will continue adding more unique pages. That one maybe a little bit less, but we'll defend it in a moment, okay? Therefore, as your organization grows, your site's compilation time gets slower. And this doesn't stop. It continues, it continues, it continues as you get bigger and bigger. And this is a problem. This is a problem with static architecture, hence the title, Problems with Static Architecture. I've prepared a couple of responses to common counterpoints here for you all. I'm happy to try to respond to more, but let me just read through these quickly. On my first point, a lot of people are big fans of Hugo. I am also a big fan of Hugo. I think it's great. It's super fast. It can crank through an enormous number of pages very quickly. However, the more pages it has to crank through, the longer it takes. And so this statement is still accurate. Gatsby Cloud, another option that's trying to kind of tackle this problem of like lots of pages, slow compile times. This I think is still unreleased. The way that it's been stated to work is by taking your compilation, splitting it into a bunch of different chunks and distributing those to different cloud services to sort of like parallelize your workload. This definitely helps to compile your site faster. However, it does not change the nature of the problem. It's also a paid remote-only private closed source workaround for one specific way of generating sites. So I wouldn't build this as a blanket solution to the problem. Second one, as your organization grows, you'll continue adding more unique pages. There are plenty of organizations that don't have a specific route that like is built for adding written content, like a blog or like a news post kind of section. You might say, hey, I've got my like marketing webpage. There's not going to be that much more content on it. So I don't have this problem. I would say you will have this problem still, because as your marketing becomes more sophisticated, you'll find areas in which you need to add more pages, whether that's saying, hey, we can increase our conversion rate by adding specific targeted landing pages for like different industries or different customers, or even going to the point where you could say, hey, I know who you are, I know where you came from to get to my site, and I'm gonna serve you a unique piece of content that fits exactly what I think you're looking for, which is definitely gonna make your marketing more effective. As the organization grows, you're gonna wanna make your marketing more effective, and the unique pages will just keep going up. It'll be a long time, sure, that's possible. You might be compiling your site very fast, and you can say, hey, it's gonna be 10 years before I have so many pages, my site is slow. Still is gonna happen, so that's that. And the last one I just threw in here is like, we won't grow. This is an absolutely valid thing to say. I did some work for a local bakery that had a website. This website wasn't really going anywhere aggressively. It's a local bakery. They had their menu, they had pictures of cakes they made, they had their address, they had a contact form. They didn't have scale problems. So if you'd say, hey, you know what? You're wrong, we're not gonna continue adding more unique pages. In that case, I would say, you're right. You don't have scale problems, and so you shouldn't listen to me because this talk is about scale problems. Cool. Number 2, dynamic functionality. This one I'm gonna really rip through pretty quickly, but a static site's a static site. It can only do what a static site can do. There are a bunch of things that you need to do on static sites very frequently that are not within the capabilities of a static site. All of these are examples from one website that I worked on at my company, one of our approximately 10 that I had to implement in the first year that I worked at the company. All of these I implemented through a dynamic server, which I maintained secondarily to the website. I called it a marketing utility server, and it just was a base API that did all these things. Is this impossible to solve? No. There's plenty of ways that you can solve it. And we've all seen these and encountered them frequently. This is kind of part of how JAMstack works. You can pay a third-party service provider. There's a lot of them. For forms, there's a ton. For emails, there's a lot. For API routes to combine different sends and responses, there's a whole area of content mesh that this guy is working on right here and offering to you for money. You can also make it yourself, as I once did, and run a server with an API. I bring this up as a problem with static architecture, however, not because it's unsolvable, but because it starts eroding at the reasons that you picked static in the first place. So why did you go with a static site, right? Because it's fast, it's cheap, it's inexpensive, it's secure, right? All of these are great, extremely valid reasons. But as you add more and more of these third-party external dynamic services, every one of those starts taking hits. Maybe it's not so cheap anymore now that you're paying 10 third-party service providers to extend your site with dynamic functionality because you couldn't do it because it was static. Maybe it's not so secure anymore when you have all these extra endpoints and servers you're running. Maybe it's not so fast anymore, right? So it just starts eating away at your core philosophy, and that's why I listed it as a drawback. And certainly it's not as simple anymore. Third one. Just going to take a drink here. I think everybody knows what's going on here if you've worked with Jamstack. This is a big problem. It's been a thorn in Jamstack's side since the start. If you have a site that takes 30 seconds to compile, that's pretty fast. But it's certainly not fast enough for somebody to write a blog post into your CMS and click, hey, I want to see what my blog post looks like, and they have to wait a full 30 seconds in order to see what it looks like. Some of my sites have gone up to 30 minutes. Several of them. That's definitely unacceptable. There was a time in my past where the legitimate workflow for previewing your blog post was write the blog post, hit generate preview, come back in a half an hour, and then look at how it looks. And if you need to, you can go make changes after that. Really, if it takes more than like 2 seconds to compile, this starts to become a problem for you. This is not a problem for dynamic architecture. We can just clear the cache and serve it fresh. But it's a big problem for static, and it always has been. As always, yeah.
Somebody's got to stop pushing back on some of these things.
You can afterwards. I mean, if you want, let's take it one or two ways. Yeah. Do we want to handle them? We want to handle them at the end, or do we want to handle them?
Yeah, let's do the questions after, so everyone gets your complete.
Sounds good. So there are, of course, paid services that help to deal with this. There are ways to work around it, but it's not ideal. Okay. And my last one is fast changing dynamically rendered pages. quite a mouthful. I'll just give an example of what this is. Twitter profiles are a perfect example. There are hundreds of millions of Twitter profiles. They're based on a data set that changes and regenerates probably thousands of times every second. Every one of these pages needs to show up fully rendered in search engine results, and it needs to show up in shares for other social media things. So you need to have static markup. It can't be a blank page that generates itself based on JavaScript. This is something that's not possible to accomplish with a static site, flat out. I can say that very confidently. Happy to take examples and respond to them after. But if you're going to do this, you need server rendering. And that's how Facebook works. That's how Twitter works. That's how every major app that has fast-changing, dynamically rendered public pages works. If you run into this, you're in trouble if you're using a static site. Cool. I hope I made everyone mad now. I'm sorry. We're now going to play a really fun game, now that you'll hate me, called The Stress of Web Architecture Decisions, the game. In this game, the context is you are a newly minted CEO of a promising technology startup, and you need to design how you're going to architect your new web app, okay? I'm going to present a couple of different options. I'm going to show the pros and cons, and then at the end, we're going to take a vote on who prefers which option, okay? So prepare yourself for this. It's interactive. That's how you do talks, I think, okay? First approach, all-in dynamic. You're just building a dynamic site from the front, no part of it's static. Pros, there's no limits. No matter what you run into, you can run it. It's dynamic. You can generate every single page on demand as the user gets there, so you can handle it. I mean, Facebook is dynamic. It's fine. It does everything. You don't have to refactor things later. You know from the start that you aren't going to have those limits, so you're not faced with the possibility of an architecture refactor. Now, there are plenty of cons here too. You have a lot of complexity when it's not needed. You're just starting out your app. It's simple. You don't have much staff. You don't have much budget. You're building this big, complex architecture to handle something that is not actually big and complex yet. That's a problem. Slower time to market because of it. If you're building out this huge foundation for something you don't have yet, it's going to take you longer than someone who builds an appropriate sized foundation for what they have. And of course, it's more expensive. As we all know, one of the big benefits of static sites is that they're very cheap to host, and that makes a huge difference for a business. It's not so much the case with a complex dynamic architecture. Worst case scenario, okay? Yeah, that's also potentially true, depending on how you couch. Oh, Lord. This is going to be a good one. Should have made this a beer. This is good. This is how I wanted it to go. Worst case scenario, okay? You went all in dynamic. Competitors beat you to market with a simpler, faster option that costs them less. Your resources get drained due to higher costs and complexity. You should all be happy to hear this, okay? This is good, all right? You won't be so happy about this one. All in static, okay? What are the benefits? Fast, easy start. You know, you're taking a simple, straightforward, inexpensive, secure approach, gets you off the ground very quickly. It's great. Low cost, low complexity. You can start with just what you need. Huge benefits here. Drawbacks, limitations, as we just went over, the things we just talked about. No further necessary discussion there. And getting around them is brutal. If you're all in static, you're definitely not going to change the dynamic because the refactor is too expensive. Working around these limitations can be really, really costly and difficult. Worst case scenario here. As your product matures, you need crazy workarounds to limitations of static. They're more expensive and cause more velocity reduction than dynamic. Competition crushes you over time with further efficiency as you get to a large, complex product. Okay? And then the final option here, because I don't think the reverse is very viable, is start with static, and at some point, once the project becomes large and complex enough, you refactor it into dynamic. You get all the pros of everything we talked about before. No limits, fast, easy start. The con is pretty obvious, the enormously expensive refactor that sits in the middle of it. Worst case scenario here is you make it to market, start maturing, but as soon as you hit that point where you need to run the refactor, your growth stalls, your expenses skyrocket, the resources get drained, and you get outpaced by competition. Okay? So, it's voting time. You all ready? I'm going to give you all 3 seconds to think about this.
There's another option, right? I mean,
No. These are the only options, okay? This is,
You can mix it. You can do static and dynamic.
we'll talk about that, okay? We'll get there. I'm talking about what's currently available for us. Put up your hand if you would, as your CEO, go all in dynamic. Okay, put up your hand if you would go all in on static. Okay, and put up your hand if you would start static and refactor dynamic. Interesting. Wow, I had no idea when I was planning this talk how it would turn out. Now I have one more question. Who of the people who voted was totally happy and confident in their answer? Please put up your hand. Very paltry. And you know why? Because it was a rigged question. The options are terrible. All of these options are awful. Let's be honest. I'm sure as you were thinking about which one you picked, you were not feeling good about it. And the reason is because right now, the options that we have for a business that plans to grow but needs to start simple are not very strong. And that is the problem that I'm here to talk about the solution for. Okay? So let's get into the solution. As you might have found out from the spoiler in the title of my talk, I'm pretty convinced that the solution here is NextJS. Because the way that NextJS handles the split between static and dynamic is different. And the core of their philosophy at the moment is that rather than having to choose between static or dynamic, you abstract this up one level and you write one code base that can either build as dynamic or it can build as static. And regardless of how you choose to build it, your code base is the same. And the differences in how they perform are based on how you write your code. One code base. You deploy as static or dynamic. In fact, you can take one code base and deploy the same thing exactly as both at the same time. And one example is my company's website, HashiCorp.com. We have one single Next.js code base, and we have two deployed instances of this code base. One of them runs on Heroku, and it's completely dynamic. The other one runs on Netlify, and it's fully static built. The code is exactly the same between both of them. Really, really cool. Before this, I don't even want to talk about what lengths we had to go to in order to achieve this functionality. But if you want to hear about it, you can talk to Michael. There's a next stage to this, and that's what I want to go into today. And it is taking the concept one step further from you take the code base and you compile it either to static or dynamic to you take the code base and you deploy it as dynamic. Your server decides whether it's serving each route as a static page or as a dynamic page, depending on how you indicate it in your code. So as you well know, when you make a static site, it still uses a web server. That web server, in the case of a pure static site, is only doing one thing. It's saying when the request comes in, give me the file, and I'm going to serve that file back. You can have a web server that makes a decision based on which request it was, on whether it's just going to give you back a file or whether it's going to do something a little bit more involved. So this way you can have one code base that's deployed to one place, and it acts exactly the way you want for every place that you have it, which is really cool. And so now it's time to do a live demo of some of that stuff. If you are not familiar with Next.js, I apologize, because this is probably going to be confusing. If you are, it will hopefully be interesting. Let's go for it. Is that good? Visible? Okay. So I made this little sample app, and I'm going to kind of work through this quickly. In Next.js, you put pages in a pages thing, and I want to show first this initial props example. Let me really just make this take up the whole thing. The bigger code is throwing me off. Okay. So get initial props is Next.js's current method of fetching data for a template. And this is the way it looks. You have your React component up here, and you attach get initial props as a property on your React component. Get initial props is an async function, and you can do whatever you want in it. You can fetch the data however you like. Here I just used fetch, and I have this like random example like JSON thing that returns sample blog posts. And whatever you return from here comes in as props to your component, and is fully handled by Next.js routing the like fetching of that data. So I'm going to run this and show you what it looks like in a browser. Should I blow this up? Probably. Okay. So I'm going to go to get initial props, and here it is. These are the random posts that I fetched. There's something interesting here in the network tab that I want to show. So let me blow this up. Can I get rid of this? Yeah. Okay. So here, as you can see, when I refresh the page in the network tab, he's too mad at me. I blew it. I'm sorry. In the network tab, you can see there's no actual request to this JSON server at all. Nothing happens here. However, if I go to the home page and I clear the tab and then I go here, we see that there is a request to the JSON example server. Why is this, right? I can refresh this page and there's no request to that server anywhere. The reason is because Next.js is a server-rendered framework. So on the first view of a page, that view is rendered by the server. On any subsequent views, they're rendered on the client. Whenever anything is rendered on the client with getInitialProps, it executes fully in the client. So when we go to home, we refresh, we clear, we go to getInitialProps, we can see that full component executing in the client, including the data fetching. If you don't need to fetch that data every single time any person views the page, this is inefficient and not great. So this is what we currently have in Next.js. Let's move on to what they are coming up with next. As you can see, this is not quite yet released by the unstable prefix, but it is usable. So if anyone is using Next.js, feel free to come talk about it afterwards or just give it a shot. But with static props, things work differently. So I'm going to do a client-side navigation to the get static props page. We'll look at what shows up. We can see there's no request to the JSON server, but instead we have a request to staticprops.json. We look in the response. This is actually the results. What's happening with get static props is at your build, Next.js goes through looking for components that have get static props on them. Runs get static props, takes the results, exports them to a JSON file, adds an import to that JSON file into this component, and ensures that they are passed through as props. So your data is only fetched one time when you build it, like any normal static site is, and every time it's fetched based on a local request to a JSON file, which is more or less instant. This is great. It's a big upgrade if you are running static sites, and it works perfectly well when Next.js exports to a static site. Okay, let's keep going. We have another one called get server props. This is literally exactly the same function signature as get static props, except it just says server instead of static right here. This is not yet implemented. So it's a blank page. They have an RFC out for it. The way that it's going to work is similar yet different from static props in that during builds, Next.js goes through your components, finds anything that has get server props, runs that function. No, it doesn't run a function. I'm sorry. It takes the logic and drops it out to an API route that ships alongside your Next.js app. And then when it hits the page, every time the page is rendered, you go to your own server and hit the API route to run this logic, and it returns the result. So every time the page is run, you'll get this request. But the request won't come from the client side. It will execute on your server. So if you're going with like a direct shot to a connected database, you can still run that even though it sits alongside your front-end code, because while this is front-end code, everything in here is only run on the server. And so this is server-side code. And as it goes through the build, any dependencies that you pulled in to deal with your server-side code get swiped out, and so they don't get included in your client-side bundle. Okay. Another interesting thing is get static paths. Next.js has a concept of dynamic pages where when you include brackets around a parameter as part of a page path, it will render this parameter as if you're going to express and doing something like that, where it's variable. So you could do 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. Okay? So when you have a dynamic page, the question is, if you're building a static site, how do you render a dynamic page? There's not really any way to do it. the static site, when it builds, must render out every single page individually. Next.js's answer to that is this method called getStaticPaths, which is only run when you export a static site, and it asks you to return every instance of the parameter that you need for these pages. So I'll go to this in dynamic mode, which is what it's running on locally. Sorry. And you could see that we get back just one post. Here's the second post, and it renders just fine. And I will exit my server and run a static export so we can see how this turns out when we run it as a static site. Should show up in the out folder. Here it is. So if we go into static paths, you can see that we have 1, 2, and 3. It's faithfully gone through, run this function, figured out how many posts and what the posts are, and rendered each one out as a page. And if I run a server on my out folder, which runs on 5,000, you can see these pages run perfectly well as static, as well as get static props and get initial props. So I've just demoed both how you can mix up both things in dynamic mode and also how you can run a parallel export to static and dynamic at the same time. I know that was a bit of a lightning round, but open to questions later. Let's get back to the slides. Okay, these are the 3 things I wanted to demo. Okay, so let's quickly go through how this takes care of some of the limitations of static that I talked about earlier. Unbounded page growth. So there are 2 ways that Next.js handles this. You like that animation? The first one is that it splits up the Babel compilation and the export. So the Babel compilation happens at one time, but the way that pages are exported is split to a separate process that's multi-threaded. So if you have 10 CPUs, 4 CPUs, whatever, you'll run through your template compilation. And if one template renders 1,000 pages, that takes what time it takes to render that one template. However, the actual exporting of the 1,000 pages is split across every core that's available. And so you can reduce your compile time by dividing it by the number of cores you have on your computer. So if you pull up a computer that has 4 cores, every 4 pages that you add is equal to 1 additional page. So out of the box, it's pretty good with like reducing the amount of compile time if you want to run up everything as static straight up. And that's what this was. And then also, if that still becomes too much for you, you can just swap any route to dynamic and it's fine. It just will happen immediately and you won't have to deal with 10,000 pages compiling each as static. They'll just run as dynamic. If you need to, you can warm the cache for your most common hits. Okay, dynamic functionality. This one's pretty easy. They have an API folder that you can put inside of pages and Next.js apps, and it runs as an Express API. So it's great. It can do full dynamic things because it is actually a dynamic framework and not a static one. So it fooled you all. Also, they're deployed in this very interesting way by splitting out each one of your routes to like a cloud function, like a AWS Lambda function, and then it deploys this collection of functions out to an eventual host such that each one can have its cache cleared individually. I won't get too deep into this, but like it's cool, it's interesting, it makes things run a little bit quicker. Yeah, and you get full server rendering, so it's SSR, that's it. Content preview, nice and easy, deploys dynamic, it's been done. You just have a static deploy, you have a dynamic deploy, or dynamic deploy is your content preview. Nice and easy. There's more goodness coming here soon. The Next.js team is working on methods that can be added to like get static props and such that you can indicate using an environment variable, whether you're using a preview environment or not, and it will behave differently depending on what your environment is. That is still early stages, but it's coming and it should be really cool. And this one, also pretty easy. You can just use get server props. It'll fetch fresh every single time, and you'll just be rendering pages fully dynamically. So nice and easy. And then I want to just quickly run through some table stakes, things that you have as part of this framework by default. You get route-based code splitting, which is really nice without having to do any configuration. This works for CSS if you're using CSS modules, which is also a new feature. You get some crazy Webpack bundle optimization. Nobody wants to deal with Webpack. I certainly don't. And this just like does it for you and you don't have to deal with it, which is nice. You get server rendering out of the box. You can load data in any way from any source. As you saw, the way that data is loaded is just an async function. So you can run whatever you want. You want to do GraphQL, go for it. You want to do fetch, go for it. You want to connect directly to a database, that's fine. So it's nice and easy and flexible. You can do client or server-side routing. In my demo, you saw client-side routing. If you use the next link component, it will route on the client side. If you just use an A tag, it will do a normal, like, we hit the server to get the new page type routing. So you have a lot of flexibility there too. Prefetching and all that stuff it does, so it'll scan your page for links and it'll go get the JavaScript in advance and prepare them as you scroll them into view. They have configuration and plugin customization that's pretty flexible. You can go straight into the Webpack settings and change them if you want to. It's not ideal because no one wants to deal with Webpack, but you can do it. And then threw this in last, but if you're using TypeScript, it just configs for you out of the box and it works with TypeScript and does that checking, which is convenient. This is all just stuff that's a pain for you to set up manually, and having it there already is nice. So I'm a big fan of NextJS. It's wonderful. However, I don't want to go against my own philosophy and just tout the benefits of something without touting the drawbacks. So I want to talk about some of the strengths and weaknesses of NextJS and where it's appropriate to use and where it's not appropriate. So I think it's really great for these three categories: companies that are growing, companies that are venture funded and therefore by necessity growing, and web applications. These are things that you know are going to start small. They're going to quickly grow to become more and more complex. And having that flexible foundation that can handle no matter what complexity you throw at it is really, really helpful, key for this type of business. What it's not good for, this type of thing. A small, simple, straightforward website. It's not going to get that crazy. It's not going to get way more complex. It presents information. It's done with it. This is not a good application for NextJS. And the reason is because NextJS is changing really fast. Things are changing all the time. It's way more complicated than something like Eleventy. It's way more complicated than straight HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And it's absolutely nowhere close to future-proof. It's going to change. Dependencies will update. Major versions will release. React will change as well. Everything is going to change. So my rule of thumb that I put on the left here, no, it's not, is that you want to have at least one full-time web dev on the product before you start considering NextJS. If it's something where you made it and you might come back in a couple of months to toss an update on there, NextJS is going to be a nightmare for you because you're going to come back, everything will have changed, all the dependencies will be broken, and you're like, I just wanted to change this text. It's not worth it. But if you're part of a growing company that you have a really demanding, fast pace of change, this is super, super valuable. So every tool has its use cases. That's all I had. So thank you. I'm welcome to hate.
Thank you, Jeff. That was enlightening. Do we have any questions or comments?
Yeah, hit me hard. Go for it. How do you got
Hold on. We're going to start here. Sorry.
Okay, just kidding.
Have you used Gatsby? It seems like it might be similar to Gatsby in the way that it's done, but I don't really know. Do you know?
Yes, it is not. Gatsby doesn't do dynamic websites. Gatsby only does static outputs.
Other integrations with CDNs for advanced caching, which is needed for dynamic part of it?
It depends on where you host. So certainly not as part of the framework because that's not possible. If you want to host with Zeit's hosting service, there certainly are out of the box. If you want to host yourself, you can configure it. And if you want to host elsewhere, it depends on what that hosting provider offers you. There are recommendations and there are defaults that Zeit, the company who makes NextJS, offers for what should be done to deal with caching. But certainly depending on how you host it, it could be different. Probably the most reasonable option there is if you're running a NextJS app and you're hosting it with Zeit, you're certainly going to get the right answers because they've built their hosting service to run these apps. Sorry, does this like answer the questions? I'm like, you could keep like coming. Either one.
So how do you handle previews? So you're literally running one, you're deploying maybe export as the production consumer-facing side of things, and the content previews are managed by a server running on Heroku. Is that what?
Yeah. So you would just deploy the app twice. One would go to an instance of whatever you're hosting on that has like an environment variable, ensuring that like you're fetching like draft content from your CMS, and the other one would have that environment variable deactivated.
I mean, that still brings up one issue, which is that you still have to maintain that server. It has its own security issues. If you're running your own VM sort of thing, then you'll have to still maintain
Yeah, I mean,
patches. That is
certainly. If you're running anything, it could have security issues. There's no doubt. Huh? You don't need it in production. So you can put it behind a password. We have our preview server behind HTTP basic auth. We just had a third-party like pen test company run across all of our properties, including the preview server, and they tried to brute force HTTP basic and failed. So I don't know. I mean, if you think that the auth is not enough, and if you think that your like draft content is like a super large security vulnerability, you might want to put more effort into the authentication on your preview server. But otherwise, it's probably not a big deal.
Yeah. Thanks.
All right, I'm coming back.
And you can run this on your own like EC2 boxes. It's not just cloud functions.
Yeah.
Oh, great.
It's not as easy as using a pre-configured hosting service. There's some extra work involved, as it would be with hosting any complex app. You know?
Yeah, just wondering like how much like, okay, so like there's this, I don't know if you have moved to the per route thing yet fully, or is it just like in a proof of concept type of thing? Or if you can't say, you can't say.
Yeah.
I was just wondering like how much of the site is dynamic versus
Of like my company's website?
yeah, like what are we talking about in terms of
For us, it's the routes that are super content heavy that will shift to dynamic. So like we have a blog section of our website. This is several hundred posts, and those take a while to render out every single one of them fresh every time. We'll flip that to dynamic. We have a resources section that lists like HashiCorp like videos, presentations, talks, white papers. There are also several hundred records on there, and so that one's easier to run as dynamic. Anything that's gonna like, for us at the moment at least, it's like any route that's like content heavy and is like constantly growing with more and more content, we'll render as dynamic so that the compile speed of our site is like really high, and it just cranks all the static like marketing pages that are always the same, and it gets done. But really it's up to you. It depends on like how your compile speed plays out.
yeah, just interested in your usage.
We have like user login on some pages, like those ones are going to be rendered as dynamic as well. We have a lot of documentation that we're planning on like releasing a like version selector for, so you can like select from any previous version of the software to view the documentation on that. That one's definitely going to run as dynamic because it's a lot. It's like, 500 pages of docs for every single version of the software, and there's like probably like 100 plus versions of the software, so that's like a crazy number of pages, and a lot of the old versions are very infrequently viewed, so it's not worth tacking onto our build time in order to like pay for like one first hit that doesn't get cached.
And does the the SPR feature, does that feature heavily in your calculations, or is it just like a nice to have?
What do you mean by that?
Sites service pre-rendering thing, like they use a cache header to render once and then cache at the edge for all this dynamically rendered stuff.
Yeah, there's some stuff there that I don't think I can probably talk about in a recorded video, but the whole like caching thing depends heavily on like, it really relates a lot to what Jeff was talking about before of like, what is your priority of like, when somebody goes to the page, does it have to be the latest version? And they tolerate going to the page to see an outdated version, and then the next time they go, it's up to date, or having a flicker of what's up to date there. That whole like theory that Zeit's been pushing, it depends a lot on stale while revalidate, which is exactly what Jeff was talking about. So I think it really depends on what page you're talking about and what the needs are on that page, and like how your users react to the updates, and like how big the updates are and how frequent they are, right? If you have a huge revamp coming out all the time, and you like load the old page and the person scrolled halfway through it and then it like flickers into a new version of the page, that could be really disorienting. There's an argument to be made that it's worse to do that than to just wait a little bit longer for the initial render but have it be correct. So like that's a really super tough question to answer, but I think it's highly context dependent. I'm talking too much. I'm not the same, right?
You how's the documentation? Like you mentioned that NextJS changes on a regular basis or will change and updates come. Like, is the documentation clear? Is it clear like what's coming and when?
Yeah, what's coming, definitely not as clear. They tend to shade towards a strategy of like, once it's released, they'll make a big announcement of like the fact that it has been released to try to, because they don't want to tell people something's coming and then have people bang down their door being like, when is it going to be here? They just kind of like wait until it's out. And then they're like, hey, this is a big deal. It just came out in the latest version. You can use it right now. There are ways you can find out what's coming by like getting involved in the community and stuff, of course, but it's like not on the official channels. Anything that's out tends to be in their docs. But as far as like these things, some of the things that I demoed that have unstable before them, you're not going to find them in the docs. But I just was excited about it, and I thought other people might be excited. So, you know, you can still use it. It's just not documented currently. It will be as soon as it's released.
Any other questions?
One of the kind of big things with JavaScript in the last couple of years has been the over dependency kind of like tree of you have one dependency that depends on like 500 other dependencies. Do you guys see yourselves moving more into doing a full like native JavaScript implementation or kind of keeping on having other JavaScript dependencies in Next.js?
I don't know if I fully understand the question.
I guess the main concern is a lot of the times you kind of have like security patches that come around with any JavaScript packages that aren't directly related to the package you're using. Are you guys thinking about that? That sort of kind of, you know, if for an example, let's just say you have like, I don't know, Lodash has a security patch. Are you guys thinking of like, how can we do this natively rather than using other dependencies on our package?
That's a good question. I don't think it has a lot to do with the talk contents, but like, that's okay. Sure. I'm happy to answer it. I also think that's context dependent, right? I mean, there's a high cost to you taking something that exists that someone else has already written, that's been used across hundreds of websites, you know, bugs have been squashed, it's been battle hardened, and just like implementing your own version from scratch because you don't like the fact that it's a dependency. There's an argument to be made about how that's a silly thing to do. There's also your argument, which is perfectly fair, which is that like, as soon as you introduce a dependency, you're adding someone else's code to your code base. It could have security vulnerabilities. You're gonna have to stay on top of updates for it. And I think the answer to like which road you take on that option sort of depends on like how big is the piece of code that you're implementing, how much free dev time do you have, how much is security a concern for you, how on top of updates are you able to stay. If you have at least one person full time, you can probably stay on top of dependency updates. We have a lot of dependencies that we use. We will rarely, if ever, rewrite a dependency just for the sake of not having it be a dependency, because I have a team with more than 10 people and we're on top of dependency updates. Sure. Obviously, if you don't have that, it might be a different argument. So like, yeah, it's a very good question. It's something you should definitely be thinking about. But the answer is not like, I can't just like give you a answer. It depends on your scenario.
Sure, sure. Thank you.
You didn't mention it, but I assumed it is based on React, and only React based. It's not like you can take out React out of Next. Am I right here?
I should have mentioned that. This was like definitely not like an introduction to Next style thing. So I apologize for anyone not super familiar. But yes, Next.js is a server rendered React framework. If you don't like React, don't use Next.js. Definitely not. That's a very poor choice.
Well, there's Next, which is based on Vue and is just like Next, but it doesn't have a lot of that new stuff that Next is.
It doesn't have any of this stuff that's coming. Yeah, and I don't think that they're currently thinking about it. Although it's possible they'll start thinking about it once it gets released.
Yeah.
I didn't say it, but I don't disagree.
Actually, Angular has a static site generator now. As an aside. As an aside. So, Jeff, I think you know what my question is going to be. So, you know, there's scale and then there's scale. Sergey's talked about scaling to millions of pages and that sort of thing. Very different problem. But say for us, we use Hugo, as you know, which we like because it's sort of stable binary and that sort of thing. And it's really great for agency work. And say for us, our slowest site is around 10,000 pages with a lot of complex queries between, you know, it's a product site with a lot of cross relationships and that sort of thing. And it builds in about 25 seconds. We use React and we use Vue on our pages. And so we've solved a lot of these problems. The CMS we use runs a containerized version of Hugo with hot reloading. So we get instant previews. So we've solved, I mean, we haven't solved all of some of the dynamic things that you're talking about, although Cloudflare kind of wants to solve some of that for us with their service workers on the edge that they're doing with HTML rewrites and stuff like that. So people are kind of solving these problems in a different way. And I kind of feel like there's an opportunity there to say, well, when I'm building pages, I'm going to use a tool that builds the pages. And then when I'm using things that need JavaScript, I'm going to use JavaScript instead of saying I'm going to use JavaScript for everything. Yeah. What do you think?
I mean, of course, as with every answer, it depends on like what you're making and what the scenario is. But I think it's very easy to find yourself in a spot where you've invested in static and then things got bigger and they got more complex and you're like, all right, you kind of like take for granted the fact that like this is how you're architected and then start thinking, okay, how can I like work around this problem that's come up? And I think it's important sometimes to like pull yourself out of that and be like, what if I just didn't use static? This would be really easy to solve. And like, have I outgrown it? You know, maybe the answer is no, but as long as you're like considering that and you've answered it definitively as no, I think that you're on the right track. I've seen some really crazy workarounds to some of these limitations of static that you wouldn't have had to do any type of workaround at all if you had just not done it as static. And so I think there is a spot where you can say like, we've invested a lot in this. We don't want to refactor it. And so we're going to stick with it and use this workaround because it's not that crazy. But like, when does that scale stop? As long as you're always zooming out and thinking about like, have we gone overboard with this one? And you've honestly answered yourself no, then you're in the right spot, honestly. I mean, I'm certainly not advocating everyone go dynamic, not at all. Different tools for different uses. But if it's getting more complex, if it's getting more expensive, if it's getting crazier, if you're starting to use more and more workarounds to problems that have been solved long ago by dynamic sites, it's worth thinking about, at least.
Can NextJS currently generate static pages from an API?
From their API routes?
No, from an API. If you had data that lives in an API, you can do that just like an SSGs?
You'd run get static routes.
Okay, so that works now.
Put your fetch in the API and it's a fully static page.
Okay, cool. Any other questions? Awesome.
That was a lot. Thank you for all those good questions.
Thank you, Jeff.